In this video, I want to talk about a different type of research study that's been gaining traction in education. And that's using big data. Now, it's not always big data. Big is one of those subjective terms that's a matter of opinion. But education systems, both school districts and departments of education, are collecting more and more information on things like student testing and performance and placements and graduation or dropping out, and other types of educational experiences and outcomes. And while that understandably makes some people nervous, when used right with proper precautions and safeguards, this data can be a powerful tool to help children. For example, this type of data and this type of research has been common in the health field for decades, where we would look at health records for people to see all sorts of things like the long-term impact of smoking on smokers and the people around them, or the catastrophic impact that a medication for pregnant women had on their fetuses. In education, this type of work often involves analyzing what's called administrative data. That's data collected by governments, agencies, or organizations as part of their operational procedures. In education, this may include data on student enrollment or placement or services they receive or testing data. All the different types of data that are used to monitor how schools, teachers, or students are doing. What I'd like to talk about is a study that was led by Shafin 2 that was published in the Journal of Early Hearing Detection and Intervention. Now, before we start, two things. Yes, it's that Shafin 2 whose name appears with mine on these slides. And yes, the acronym for the Journal of Early Hearing Detection and Intervention is pronounced JEDI. Yeah, we're all geeks. In this study, we wanted to see if results from newborn hearing screening, that's done when babies are hours old, could be used to predict whether or not a child had autism 5 to 10 years later. Now, that may seem crazy. Why would we think there's a link between hearing screening at birth and autism years and years later? But there is a basis for thinking that there might be. Now, how do you screen for hearing loss in a newborn? You can't put headphones on and ask them to raise their little hand when they hear a beep. So one approach is to put headphones on the baby with different auditory stimuli and then measure brainwave activity in the auditory brainstem. That's the son of our former IT lead getting screened here in Maine. Their results are then compared to the results for children without hearing loss. If it looks similar, the baby passes their screen and that's that. But if it doesn't look similar to children without hearing loss, then the baby's sent for more elaborate and detailed diagnostic testing. Now, where it gets interesting is that some studies of older individuals with autism who had comprehensive medical checkups found that a certain percentage of them showed atypical patterns of auditory brainstem activity. Now, these are big, elaborate tests where you're looking at actual brain wave patterns. Newborn screening just gives you a very simple pass if things look similar to a normal hearing child, or refer if things don't look sufficiently similar and the baby needs to be referred for further diagnostic testing. And remember, it's not looking for autism or anything else. It's strictly looking at whether the pattern is similar to a child with normal hearing. Based on the findings with older individuals diagnosed with autism, we wondered whether we might see a connection between these limited hearing screening results when a baby was only hours old, and future identification of autism when the child's in elementary school. To do that, we linked administrative health data on screening results for babies born in Maine with Administrative Department of Education records 5 to 10 years later for children enrolled in public school in Maine. So our question was whether babies who did not pass their screen but had normal hearing were at greater risk of being identified with autism 5 to 10 years later. Now, we focused on babies with normal hearing just in case children with hearing loss were simply at an elevated risk of autism. We wanted to avoid that possible confound. So these are babies with normal hearing, but for whom there was something about their hearing screen, something in that auditory brainstem activity at birth that looked a little different. In the past, we've always thought of these situations as just noise in the data. It looks a little different, but everything's fine. The child doesn't have hearing loss, so everyone just ignores it. But maybe it's not just noise. Maybe there's more to it. So what do we find? Well, we found that babies who did not pass their screen but had normal hearing were at 2.5 times the odds of being enrolled in special education 8 to 10 years later. This translated to 41% of our babies later being enrolled in special education, but only 19% of all other children. Now, if you're looking at that and thinking, but 41% isn't 2.5 times as big as 19%, that's because the analysis looked at the odds of being enrolled in special education, not the percent or probability. But that distinction is for a whole nother statistics conversation. What about autism? We found that babies who did not pass their screen but had normal hearing were at 6.4 times the odds of being identified with autism 8 to 10 years later. That translates to 10.5% of our babies later being identified with autism, but only 1.7% of all other children. That's pretty cool. Remember, these are physiological measures when the baby is hours old, predicting autism up to 10 years later. And this can potentially help children in a number of ways. For example, while we're definitely not suggesting that this may be a way to diagnose autism, it opens the door to the possibility of identifying at birth a subset of children who may be at increased risk later in life. While we always thought of these cases where a child did not pass their screen, but in fact had normal hearing, as just noise in the data, maybe it's not just noise. Maybe there are signals for other developmental outcomes in that auditory brainstem activity at birth. And remember, this screen wasn't tuned to determine risk for autism. It was tuned, no pun intended, to detect hearing loss. Maybe algorithms specifically designed to differentiate children who later have autism versus those who later do not have autism may improve this even further. Maybe algorithms could be developed for other cognitive developmental outcomes. In the more immediate term, when a child who did not pass their screen is diagnosed with normal hearing, it's currently standard practice in the healthcare community to close the case and move on. But this suggests that parents and providers may want to continue to monitor language, behavioral, and cognitive developmental milestones for children who don't pass their screen, even if they're later diagnosed with normal hearing. Now, before wrapping up, let's take a moment and look at some of the parallels between this type of research using administrative data and historical research. Notice that in both types of research, the actual nature of the data being collected and analyzed is beyond the control of the researcher. If you're doing historical research and looking at newspaper stories or journal entries from 100 years ago, you're limited to the data that other people created for you. Late at night, you may find yourself screaming, "Why didn't they write more about that important story?" But there's nothing you can do about it. It is what it is. In a similar way, more than once I've been analyzing administrative data and wanted to scream, "Why didn't they collect that variable?" Or, "Why did they code their data this way?" For example, why not have records for people with why not have records for people with multiple disabilities check all of the boxes that apply instead of checking one box that says multiple disabilities? That tells you absolutely nothing about what actual disabilities they were experiencing. But again, it is what it is. On the bright side, both types of research can provide you a much more timely and immediate answer to a question that may take decades to answer if you have to set up a new study and follow things forward into time. Think if we'd started with babies now who didn't pass their screen and had to wait 10 years to see if they had autism. Or finding a bunch of 20-year-old smokers and then waiting 40 years to see whether they develop cancer or die early. You could be a school administrator and set up a policy and wait 5 years to see if it worked or what sort of problems you had. Or maybe there's some historical data on similar policies from years ago that you could find and look to see how they worked then and what sort of issues and challenges they had that time. Using existing administrative data can be efficient and timely and allow us to examine important questions that would, to be honest, be impossible to do in any practical sense without it. Okay, why don't we wrap things up at this point? I hope it gave you some insight into the use of administrata in research. Okay? Take care. Bye for now.